Colgaran adus novias Apache por infertiles, pero un ganadero solitario la salvo. The sun rose slowly over the small Apache village, casting a soft orange glow on the dusty ground and the simple homes made of wood and adobe. Birds sang quietly, and a cool breeze rustled through the tall grasses at the edge of the village. But despite the beautiful morning, the air was tense, almost heavy, as if the village itself sensed the darkness that was about to unfold. In the center of the village, two young women were sitting quietly by a well, unaware that their lives were about to change forever. Their names were Nayeli and Itzel, and both were known throughout the village for their kind hearts and gentle spirits. Nayeli had long black hair that shimmered in the sunlight, and her eyes were always full of curiosity and warmth. Itzel, slightly younger, had a soft smile that could calm even the angriest villager. Everyone who met them felt a sense of peace, and many had admired their courage and resilience, even in small daily matters. Yet despite their qualities, the two women had become victims of a cruel tradition, a tradition that had governed the lives of Apache women for generations. In their village, there was an old custom that dictated the role of a bride after marriage. A young woman was expected to bear children within a short period, or she would be considered cursed or infertile. This belief had been passed down for centuries, and most villagers accepted it without question. Those who dared challenge it were often silenced by the weight of collective fear and superstition. Unfortunately, Nayeli and Itzel had married men from the village who were proud of their heritage but strictly followed the old rules. Months had passed, and neither woman had conceived. The elders grew suspicious, whispering behind closed doors about the supposed curse hanging over them. The morning began quietly, but the silence was soon broken by the harsh voice of Tahu, one of the village elders. His face was stern, lined with years of authority and the belief that tradition was law. "Bring them," he commanded. A group of villagers, mostly men, moved forward reluctantly, holding ropes in their hands. Nayeli and Itzel looked up in confusion, sensing something was terribly wrong. Their husbands stood nearby, caught between fear of the elders and love for their wives, unable to intervene. "Why are you doing this?" Nayeli asked, her voice trembling but strong. Her heart pounded and fear gripped her like cold iron. "We have done nothing wrong." But the elders ignored her pleas. Their faces showed no hesitation. They believed they were serving justice, though it was a cruel and unforgiving kind. Itzel clutched her hands together, praying silently, hoping for a miracle that might save them. Her mind raced, trying to understand how people who had known them all their lives could treat them like criminals. The villagers formed a circle around the women, creating a wall of silent witnesses. Children peeked from behind their mothers, not fully understanding what was happening but sensing the gravity of the moment. Some of the men avoided looking directly at Nayeli and Itzel, shame flickering across their faces, while others followed orders without question, afraid of what disobedience might bring. The tension in the air was palpable. Ropes were thrown over sturdy branches of a large tree at the center of the village. The women's hearts sank as they realized what was about to happen. Nayeli tried to speak, to reason with the elders, but her voice seemed to vanish into the hot morning air. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at Itzel, who mirrored her fear and confusion. Both women understood that this was not just punishment. It was a declaration that their lives no longer mattered in the eyes of their community. The elder Tahu stepped closer, his voice booming. "The law of our ancestors must be followed. A woman who cannot give life brings shame to her family and the village. This is not punishment, it is justice." His words were cold and his eyes showed no doubt. Nayeli and Itzel felt the weight of centuries of belief pressing down on them, suffocating their sense of reason and humanity. The villagers worked together to tie the ropes, their movements mechanical and precise. Nayeli felt her heart racing, each beat echoing like a drum in her chest. She thought of her mother, who had always told her to be brave, and of her father, who had loved her with unwavering pride. Memories of laughter, songs, and stories from childhood flashed before her eyes, making the reality even more unbearable. Itzel, too, clung to memories of simpler, happier days, when life had been full of promise and freedom. Finally, the women were lifted off the ground, suspended by the ropes tied to the thick branches. Fear consumed them, but so did a strange, defiant sense of resilience. They refused to scream at first, holding on to each other's hands, feeling the cold rope against their skin. The sun shone brightly above, indifferent to their suffering, casting long shadows across the ground. Villagers stood silently, watching, some with faces hardened by tradition, others with faces softened by doubt. As the minutes passed, the gravity of the situation became undeniable. Nayeli's voice, though trembling, found strength again. "Please, there must be another way," she whispered, tears running down her cheeks. Itzel joined in, her voice shaking but clear. "We are not cursed. You do not know the truth about us." But the elders did not respond. Their faces were set like stone, convinced that they were upholding justice and protecting the village's honor. The women's husbands could only watch, their hearts breaking, wishing they could do something, anything, to change the course of fate. Mothers in the crowd wept quietly, unable to interfere but silently praying for mercy. Despite the horror, a few villagers felt the first seeds of doubt. Some young men and women in the crowd exchanged worried glances, questioning silently whether the tradition was truly just. The sight of Nayeli and Itzel, suspended above the ground, seemed to awaken something in them, a sense of compassion that had been buried under fear and obedience. They realized that no tradition, no matter how old, should justify cruelty. The moment stretched on, heavy and unbearable. Nayeli and Itzel clung to each other, drawing strength from their bond. They whispered words of hope, reminding each other of courage, even in the face of certain death. The world around them, the tree, the sun, the dusty village square, seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them connected by fear, love, and a desperate will to survive. In that quiet but agonizing moment, an unspoken question hung in the air. Would anyone have the courage to intervene? Would the cruelty of tradition finally meet a force of compassion? Somewhere on the outskirts of the village, beyond the reach of the crowd, a solitary figure watched from a distance. Mateo, a quiet and solitary cattle rancher, had been passing through the region when he noticed the gathering. He had never known these women personally, yet something about the scene struck him profoundly. He felt a surge of anger, sorrow, and determination. He knew that if no one acted, 2 innocent lives would be lost forever. The village seemed frozen in time, and the fate of Nayeli and Itzel hung precariously. Every heartbeat, every breath felt like an eternity. The sun climbed higher, and with each passing moment, the injustice of the situation became impossible to ignore. Nayeli and Itzel had done nothing wrong. They had followed the expectations of their families and traditions, and yet they were being punished in the most extreme and horrifying way imaginable. It was in this moment, suspended between life and death, that a spark of hope quietly emerged, an unseen force that would soon challenge the cruelty of the past. For even in the darkest moments, human courage and compassion could shine brighter than fear and superstition. Nayeli and Itzel, clinging to life and to each other, would not remain victims forever. Somewhere, someone was coming to change their destiny, and the story of injustice was about to take an unexpected turn. Mateo had been riding along the dusty trail near the edge of the village when he first heard the cries and whispers. At first, he thought it might be an argument or a quarrel, something ordinary that happened from time to time. But as he came closer, the scene unfolded before his eyes, and his heart froze. There in the center of the village, 2 young women hung from the thick branches of a large tree. Their faces were pale with fear, their hands gripping each other tightly. The villagers circled around them, some watching with stern faces, others with quiet doubt, but none stepping forward. Mateo had always been known as a solitary man, a rancher who lived far from the main village, tending his cattle and living a quiet life. He avoided conflict, preferring the company of his animals and the solitude of the land. But when he saw Nayeli and Itzel, something inside him stirred, an urgent need to act, to save these innocent lives from the cruelty of blind tradition. He dismounted his horse, letting it graze nearby, and began walking toward the crowd, keeping his eyes fixed on the women. As he approached, a few villagers turned to look at him. Mateo's reputation was well known. He was respected for his fairness, honesty, and courage. People whispered as he passed, "It is Mateo. He might interfere. Will he dare?" Some feared him, while others hoped he would take action. Mateo did not speak immediately. He simply observed the scene, noting the ropes, the frightened women, and the rigid faces of the elders. His mind raced, thinking of the quickest way to save them without causing a riot or harm. Stepping into the circle of villagers, Mateo raised his voice, calm but firm. "Stop! This is wrong. You cannot do this to them." His words cut through the tense air like a sudden gust of wind. The elder Tahu, who had been overseeing the punishment, turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "Who are you to speak, Mateo?" he demanded. "This is our law. We do not answer to outsiders." "I am a man who answers to justice," Mateo replied steadily. "These women have done nothing to deserve this. They are innocent and they do not deserve to die." His voice carried authority, not because he was loud, but because he spoke with unwavering certainty. The villagers murmured among themselves, some showing support, others confusion. The young men in the crowd looked at Mateo, admiration and hope flickering in their eyes. Tahu's face darkened with anger, but Mateo did not back down. He stepped closer to the tree, his hands steady and confident. "I will not allow this," he said. "If you hang them, it is your shame, not theirs. Let them live." For a moment the crowd was silent, stunned that anyone would dare defy the elders so openly. Nayeli and Itzel, hearing Mateo's voice, felt a flicker of hope. Their hands tightened around each other's, and tears of fear slowly turned into tears of relief. The elder Tahu shouted, trying to assert his authority. "You cannot interfere. Tradition cannot be broken." But Mateo's courage was like a shield, protecting him from fear. "Tradition does not justify cruelty," he said firmly. "You may follow your laws, but it does not make you right. These women are human beings and their lives matter." Some villagers began to question quietly among themselves. Could it be that the elders were wrong? Could it be that cruelty had been disguised as tradition for too long? The young women's terrified faces and the ropes that held them up painted a picture that could not be ignored. Mateo's presence gave voice to thoughts that had been whispered in fear for years. Slowly, the tide of hesitation began to spread through the crowd. Without wasting time, Mateo moved to the tree. He had learned in his life how to handle ropes and knots, skills that had kept his cattle safe in storms and wild terrain. Carefully, he untied the first rope, lowering Nayeli to the ground. She stumbled but stayed on her feet, her legs weak, her body trembling with relief and fear combined. Mateo caught her gently, guiding her away from the circle of villagers. Itzel watched, her eyes wide, her heart pounding. Mateo then untied the rope that held her. She fell into his arms, sobbing, finally free from the ropes that had threatened her life. The villagers watched in shock. Some were angry, feeling their authority challenged. Others were silent, unable to reconcile the justice they had believed in with the mercy unfolding before them. Mateo stood protectively in front of the women, his presence a barrier between them and those who would harm them. "They are safe now," he said calmly. "And they will remain safe." Nayeli and Itzel, still trembling, looked at Mateo with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. Who are you?" Nayeli whispered, her voice shaking. I am someone who believes that no one deserves to die for a mistake they did not make, Matteo replied. You are not cursed. You are not at fault. Come with me. You will be safe. The women hesitated for a moment, looking back at the village that had been their home, the same place that had turned against them. Fear and uncertainty battled with hope. Finally, trusting the kindness and strength in Matteo's eyes, they followed him to his horse. Matteo helped them mount carefully, and together they began the journey to his ranch, far from the judgmental eyes of the villagers. The path to the ranch was long and dusty, winding through hills and open fields. Matteo rode beside the women, speaking softly to reassure them, telling them that they were not alone anymore. Nayeli and Itzel clung to the sides of the horse, feeling both exhaustion and relief. They could hear the faint sounds of the village fading behind them, replaced by the whispering wind and the quiet rustle of the grass. For the first time since the morning began, they felt a sense of freedom. By the time they arrived at Matteo's ranch, the sun was high in the sky, casting warm light over the wide-open fields. The ranch was simple but well kept, with a small house, stables, and pastures for the cattle. Matteo led the women inside and offered them food, water, and a place to rest. They were weak from fear, dehydration, and emotional exhaustion, but the safety of the ranch gave them the first real moment to breathe in hours. As Nayeli and Itzel sat on the porch quietly sipping water, Matteo stood nearby, watching over them. "You are safe here," he said again, his voice steady. "No one can harm you here. You will recover, and when you are ready, you can decide what comes next." The women nodded silently, unable to speak. Their bodies were still trembling, but their hearts had begun to feel a spark of hope. Over the next few days, Matteo helped the women regain their strength. He gave them fresh food, clean water, and a quiet place to rest. He encouraged them to talk about their fears and their experiences, listening without judgment. Slowly, they began to share their story, describing the morning's events, the fear, and the injustice they had endured. Matteo's presence was a constant source of calm and courage, helping them understand that they were no longer alone, that there was someone who believed in justice and compassion. During this time, the bond between the three grew. Matteo treated them not as victims, but as equals, resilient women who had survived unimaginable cruelty. Nayeli and Itzel helped around the ranch as their strength returned, caring for the animals, tending the garden, and learning new skills. In turn, Matteo showed them practical work, but also the value of hope, patience, and self-worth. He taught them that life could be rebuilt, that kindness and courage were more powerful than fear and superstition. Word eventually reached the village that the women had been rescued. Some villagers were angry, believing that Matteo had overstepped his bounds. Others began to whisper, questioning whether the old ways were truly just. Slowly, a seed of doubt had been planted, a seed that would grow into a new understanding of compassion and humanity. Matteo had not only saved 2 lives, he had challenged the unquestioned cruelty that had governed the village for generations. Nayeli and Itzel, once victims of fear and tradition, began to dream of a future they had never imagined. The ranch, with its wide-open fields, quiet pastures, and safe shelter, became a place of healing. Their bond with Matteo grew stronger, built on trust, gratitude, and shared courage. They realized that while the village had condemned them, life had given them a second chance, one that they were determined to embrace. As the sun set behind the hills, casting golden light over the ranch, the three sat together, watching the cattle graze and the wind move through the fields. The horrors of the morning seemed distant, replaced by a sense of safety, hope, and new beginnings. Matteo knew that the path ahead would not be easy, but he was determined to protect the women and help them build lives full of dignity, freedom, and purpose. Nayeli and Itzel understood that their story was far from over, but for the first time, they felt they had control over their destiny. In that quiet, golden moment, The impossible had become possible. A solitary rancher had dared to intervene, defying tradition, challenging injustice, and showing that courage and compassion could change lives. Nayeli and Itzel were no longer victims. They were survivors, beginning a journey toward healing, freedom, and a life where they could finally thrive. Days turned into weeks at Mateo's ranch, and with each passing day, Nayeli and Itzel grew stronger. Their bodies had begun to recover from the physical strain of that terrible morning, and their minds were slowly learning that they were finally safe. The ranch was a quiet sanctuary, far from the judgmental eyes of the village and its cruel traditions. The soft wind through the fields, the gentle lowing of the cattle, and the open sky above offered a calm that they had never known before. It was a kind of peace that only comes after fear has been replaced with safety, and for the first time, they could breathe without the weight of constant dread pressing on their chests. Mateo treated them with patience and care, understanding that their fear would not vanish overnight. He did not rush them to speak or to move on from their trauma. Instead, he allowed them to set the pace. Each morning he would bring them fresh water and food, encouraging them gently. "Take your time," he would say. "There is no rush. You have survived something terrible and now it is time to heal." His voice was calm, steady, and full of quiet strength. Nayeli and Itzel listened, absorbing the reassurance that had been so absent in their lives. In the beginning, the women spent most of their time sitting on the porch or walking slowly through the fields, watching the cattle and breathing in the fresh air. Nayeli, always curious, began to ask questions about the ranch, about the animals, and about the land around them. Mateo answered with patience, teaching them about the work he did, the cattle he tended, and the rhythm of life in such a vast, open place. Itzel, who was quieter and more reflective, began sketching in the dirt with sticks, drawing shapes and patterns, slowly allowing herself to express the emotions she had buried deep inside. Mateo noticed these small signs of healing and encouraged them gently, praising even the smallest achievements. One day, Mateo suggested that they help with some light chores around the ranch. "It will give you something to focus on," he said. "It helps the mind as well as the body." Nayeli and Itzel hesitated at first, unsure if they could manage, but Mateo's calm encouragement reassured them. They started with small tasks, feeding the chickens, collecting eggs, and tending to the garden. Each completed task gave them a sense of accomplishment and control, something they had not felt in months. The women began to smile more often, sharing small jokes with each other, and even laughing softly at the minor mishaps that came with learning new skills. As the days went on, the women began to share more of their story with Mateo. They spoke of the morning they had been hung, of the fear and confusion, and of the whispers of villagers who had once been neighbors and friends. Mateo listened with empathy, never interrupting, never judging. He offered his own reflections, speaking of fairness, courage, and the importance of protecting life. "What happened to you should never have happened," he said one evening as they watched the sun set over the fields. "It is a terrible thing that tradition can sometimes hide cruelty, but now you are free, and I will do everything I can to make sure it stays that way." The women began to see Mateo not just as a protector, but as a teacher and friend. He taught them practical skills for life on the ranch, but also the value of patience, courage, and self-worth. They learned to ride horses, mend fences, and tend the fields. Mateo encouraged them to make decisions, to take responsibility for small parts of the ranch, and slowly they began to feel a sense of independence. This independence was new and empowering. For the first time, Nayeli and Itzel felt that they could shape their own lives, that they were not defined by the cruel judgment of others. During this time, the women also began to bond with the animals on the ranch. The soft nuzzles of calves, the curious clucks of the chickens, and the gentle companionship of the horses brought them comfort. They spoke to the animals as if they could understand, pouring out their worries, fears, and hopes. In return, the animals offered quiet, unconditional acceptance. This connection with life around them helped heal wounds that words alone could not reach. As the weeks passed, Mateo encouraged the women to start small projects of their own. Naeli began planting flowers and herbs in a small patch of the garden, while Itzel began weaving baskets and mats. These simple acts gave them a sense of purpose and accomplishment. Mateo praised their work, reminding them that building something with one's own hands could bring pride and confidence. Slowly, they began to reclaim a sense of identity, one that had been taken from them by fear and injustice. One afternoon, as the sun bathed the ranch in golden light, Naeli and Itzel sat under a tree, talking quietly about their lives before the village. Naeli spoke of her mother, her father, and the dreams she once had for the future. Itzel shared memories of childhood games, songs, and stories. Talking about these memories brought both laughter and tears, and for the first time, they felt the full range of emotions without the suffocating fear of punishment. Mateo joined them, sitting quietly and listening. He did not try to fix their feelings, he simply offered his presence as a safe space. This silent support was more powerful than any words. Slowly, the women began to open their hearts to hope. They realized that the world was not entirely cruel, that kindness and courage could exist even in places where tradition had caused pain. They began to imagine a future where they could live freely, make their own choices, and help others who might face similar injustices. Mateo encouraged these dreams, reminding them that life could be rebuilt, piece by piece, with patience, effort, and courage. The bond between the three deepened with each passing day. Mateo had saved their lives, but in the process, they had become a family of sorts. They shared meals, chores, and quiet moments of reflection. The women began to see themselves not as victims but as survivors, capable of rebuilding their lives and finding strength in the face of adversity. Mateo treated them with respect and equality, reinforcing the idea that they were worthy of care, protection, and dignity. As the days turned into weeks, the women began to regain confidence. Naeli's curiosity led her to explore new ideas and ways of living, while Itzel's creativity blossomed through her weaving and artwork. Mateo encouraged them to take pride in their accomplishments, no matter how small, and to celebrate the progress they had made. The ranch became a place of healing, growth, and learning, a sanctuary where the past horrors could slowly be replaced with hope and opportunity. The women also began to discuss their future with Mateo. They talked about visiting the village, not as punished women, but as survivors who had endured injustice and returned with dignity. Mateo supported their desire to reconnect with their past in a safe way, understanding that closure could be an important step in their healing. Together, they planned small, careful steps that would allow them to face the world again, but on their own terms. By the end of the third month, Naeli and Itzel were no longer the frightened, trembling women who had been rescued. They were strong, capable, and independent, ready to face life with newfound courage. Mateo had not only saved their lives physically, but he had also nurtured their spirits, helping them rebuild their sense of self-worth and dignity. The ranch had become a place of transformation, where fear had been replaced with hope, despair with courage, and victimhood with resilience. In the quiet evenings, as the sun set over the rolling fields, the three would sit together, sharing stories, plans, and dreams. The horrors of the past were not forgotten, but they no longer held power over the women's lives. Naeli and Itzel had discovered that life could be kind, that people could act with courage and compassion, and that even in the darkest moments, hope could shine through. Mateo had become more than a protector. He was a guide, a friend, and a symbol of the power of empathy and bravery. And so the days continued, each one bringing new lessons, new experiences, and new moments of healing. Naeli and Itzel, once victims of injustice, were growing into women who could live freely, confidently, and with purpose. Mateo's quiet courage had not only saved their lives, but had given them the tools, support, and inspiration to build a future that was entirely their own. News of the rescue spread slowly at first, carried by travelers, villagers who had ventured near Mateo's ranch, and whispers along the dusty trails. At first, many in the Apache village refused to believe it. How could two young women, once condemned and hung, be alive and well? Some dismissed the story as rumor, thinking it impossible for anyone to have defied the elders and saved them. Others, however, could not ignore the reports. Curiosity, mixed with shock and even guilt, began to ripple through the village like a quiet wind. The elders, led by Tahu, were furious. Their authority, long unquestioned, had been challenged in a way they had never imagined. They called meetings in secret, discussing how to respond to Mateo's actions. Some argued that the women should be brought back to face the law, but fear of Mateo's reputation and courage held them back. Others, quietly, began to question the fairness of the tradition itself. They had seen the women's bravery, heard Mateo's words, and realized that the punishment had been harsh, cruel, and unnecessary. For the first time, doubt crept into hearts that had long accepted rigid rules without question. Young villagers, especially, were moved by the story. They had grown up hearing that the law of tradition was absolute, yet now they witnessed an example of courage, compassion, and justice that contradicted everything they had been taught. They discussed in hushed tones the events of that day, wondering whether they too could have acted differently if they had been present. Naeli and Itzel had become symbols, whether the villagers realized it or not, symbols of resilience, innocence, and the power of mercy. Meanwhile, at Mateo's ranch, the women continued their healing and growth. Mateo encouraged them to remain strong but also to consider carefully how they might engage with the village when the time was right. One step at a time, he advised. They must see you not as victims but as survivors. Your dignity and courage speak louder than words. The women listened, taking comfort in his guidance, realizing that their lives were no longer dictated by fear or tradition. Despite their recovery, Naeli and Itzel were curious about the village. They had left behind families, neighbors, and the very people who had once condemned them. Mateo, understanding their desire to reconnect, helped them plan a cautious visit. "It is important that you decide when and how to face them," he said. "This is your choice, not theirs." With preparation, reassurance, and Mateo's presence, they finally decided to return, not seeking revenge, but seeking understanding, closure, and perhaps a chance to plant seeds of change. When they arrived at the village, the reaction was immediate. People stopped what they were doing, staring in disbelief. Some averted their eyes, ashamed of how they had treated the women. Others whispered in shock, unable to reconcile the image of two strong, composed women with the memory of helpless victims hanging from the tree. Naeli and Itzel walked calmly, their heads held high, supported by Mateo's quiet presence. They did not plead, cry, or beg. They simply walked, demonstrating strength born of survival and courage. The elders, taken aback by their composure, struggled to respond. Tahu, the most vocal of the traditionalists, found himself at a loss. His face, once stern and unyielding, betrayed uncertainty. He realized that the women had returned not broken, but stronger. Their presence challenged the authority he had long relied upon and questioned the justice of the laws he had enforced. Mateo spoke on their behalf, calmly reminding the elders and villagers that compassion was not weakness, that mercy was not dishonor, and that human life held value beyond rigid tradition. Slowly, the villagers began to listen. The younger ones especially were inspired by the courage and dignity displayed by Naeli, Itzel, and Mateo. Some elders continued to resist, fearing change, but the momentum was undeniable. The women, through their actions and calm presence, demonstrated that justice could be achieved without cruelty, and that empathy could coexist with tradition. Conversations began to emerge, first in small groups, then more openly, about whether certain practices were truly just, or if fear had long masked cruelty. The change did not happen overnight. Some villagers remained angry, believing that the rules of the past should never be challenged. Others, however, began quietly questioning old beliefs. Mothers who had once feared the same fate for their daughters began to see the value of compassion. Fathers began to recognize that protecting life and dignity could be more important than following harsh traditions. The story of Nayeli and Itzel, and the courage of Mateo, planted a seed that slowly began to grow into a movement of moral reflection. Back at the ranch, Nayeli and Itzel continued to strengthen their skills and confidence. They learned to care for livestock, tend to crops, and even help Mateo with practical problem-solving around the ranch. Each task, while simple in appearance, reinforced their sense of independence and self-worth. They realized that life could be rebuilt, that past injustices did not have to define them, and that they had the ability to influence others in meaningful ways. The women also began teaching local children and younger villagers who visited the ranch. They shared lessons not just about practical work, but about courage, resilience, and kindness. They spoke carefully, knowing that words could heal or harm. Slowly, more people came to see the ranch as a safe place, a school of compassion, and a place where values of respect and dignity were taught through example. Mateo encouraged this growth, guiding the women to lead without domination, to teach without arrogance, and to inspire without fear. As weeks turned into months, the effects of their presence in the village became more noticeable. Families who had previously supported harsh traditions began to reconsider their stance. Discussions emerged about the fairness of customs, the importance of mercy, and the value of human life. Even the elders, though hesitant at first, began to acknowledge that change was necessary. The story of the two women had become more than an isolated event. It had sparked reflection, dialogue, and moral awakening within the community. The transformation, though gradual, was undeniable. Where once there had been fear, there was now hope. Where once there had been cruelty, there was now compassion. And where once there had been unquestioned obedience to harsh rules, there was now discussion, questioning, and the beginnings of reform. Nayeli and Itzel, through their strength and the guidance of Mateo, had helped reshape a community's understanding of justice. Yet, even as change took root, the women never forgot the pain of their past. They honored the memory of the morning they had been hung, understanding that their survival carried responsibility. They vowed to help others who might face injustice, to advocate for those silenced by fear, and to teach that courage and compassion could overcome cruelty. Mateo supported them fully, helping them find ways to turn their trauma into purpose, transforming suffering into strength. The village, though still imperfect, began to shift slowly toward a new era. Families started questioning traditions that caused harm, young people began to value empathy over fear, and elders realized that leadership required wisdom, compassion, and fairness. Nayeli and Itzel became living proof that justice and mercy were possible, even in the face of long-held customs. They had survived not just physically, but spiritually, teaching those around them that human dignity was more important than rigid rules. Over time, Mateo's ranch became a hub for community learning and support. Villagers came not just for guidance in practical skills, but to witness the example of courage, compassion, and resilience. Nayeli and Itzel taught lessons of kindness, the importance of speaking out against injustice, and the value of supporting one another. Mateo guided them, ensuring that their influence was grounded in wisdom, patience, and moral integrity. The story of the two women and the solitary rancher became a symbol that spread beyond the village. Travelers who passed through shared tales of courage, survival, and moral courage. People began to speak of the day that two women once condemned had returned with dignity, forever changing the hearts and minds of a community. It became a legend, not of violence or fear, but of hope, justice, and the transformative power of empathy. By the time the sun set over the village months later, the community was quietly different. The conversation about tradition and justice continued, but now it was balanced with compassion. Families acted more thoughtfully, questioning the fairness of harsh customs. Children learned that fear and cruelty were not the only ways to enforce rules, and that kindness and courage could shape lives far more positively. Nayeli and Itzel had become guiding lights, showing that even the smallest act of bravery could spark a chain of meaningful change. And through it all, Mateo remained a quiet presence, watching the women grow, supporting their choices, and reminding the community that courage and mercy were powerful forces that could reshape not just individual lives, but the hearts of an entire village. The transformation had begun slowly, quietly, and steadily, and its effects would be felt for generations to come. Years had passed since Mateo rescued Nayeli and Itzel from the cruel judgment of the village. Time had a gentle way of healing wounds, and the women had grown stronger in every way, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. The ranch, once simply a place of refuge, had become a home filled with warmth, life, and purpose. Mateo, ever patient and wise, continued to guide them, but now the women were confident enough to make many decisions on their own. They had transformed from frightened victims into capable, independent women whose courage had changed the course of their lives, and even the lives of the people around them. Life on the ranch settled into a rhythm that felt natural and fulfilling. Nayeli spent her days tending to the garden, raising animals, and teaching younger villagers who came to learn about farming and animal care. She had discovered a love for nurturing life, not only plants and animals, but also people. She became a mentor to girls who had grown up hearing stories of harsh traditions, showing them through her example that courage and independence were far stronger than fear. Itzel, meanwhile, developed her creative skills. She wove baskets and mats with intricate designs, crafted small decorations for the house, and even began teaching younger children to weave. Her gentle guidance and artistic talent inspired others, turning simple crafts into lessons about patience, skill, and pride in one's work. Mateo watched the two women with quiet satisfaction. He had saved their lives, but he had also given them the tools and freedom to create new lives for themselves. He never imposed his decisions, only offered guidance when necessary. In doing so, he had taught Nayeli and Itzel the importance of self-respect, personal strength, and the courage to act in the face of injustice. His quiet bravery had not only saved them physically, but had empowered them to face the world with dignity. The village, which had once been so rigid and unyielding, continued to change. The story of the two women and the solitary rancher became a lesson told over and over, especially to younger generations. Mothers would remind their daughters that courage could protect them. Fathers would teach their sons that compassion was as important as strength, and elders began to recognize that tradition should be tempered with fairness. Some of the older villagers, though slow to change, started questioning the harsh practices of the past, realizing that what had been done to Nayeli and Itzel was neither right nor just. Nayeli and Itzel occasionally returned to the village, though always carefully and with Mateo's presence. They did not go to confront or punish. They went to show that they had survived and thrived, despite the cruelty that had been imposed on them. Their calm confidence impressed the villagers, demonstrating that courage and dignity were far more powerful than fear or intimidation. Mothers who had once hidden their daughters indoors began to speak openly about protecting children from unfair punishment. Fathers began to listen more to the needs of their families. Slowly, the community learned that life and dignity mattered more than blind adherence to tradition. The women's presence and influence also inspired other acts of kindness. Small changes, like helping neighbors without expecting anything in return, supporting families in need, and questioning harmful rules, began to appear throughout the village. These actions, though seemingly minor, built upon the courage demonstrated by Mateo and the resilience of Nayeli and Itzel. The ripple effect of their bravery reached far beyond the ranch, touching the hearts and minds of many, shaping a community that was slowly becoming more compassionate and thoughtful. Life on the ranch itself continued to flourish. Mateo, though older and quieter than before, still tended to his cattle and fields. He remained a guardian and mentor, ensuring that the women had both the freedom to live independently and the support they needed in times of challenge. Nayeli and Itzel, while fully capable on their own, always valued Mateo's guidance, recognizing the importance of wisdom and experience in shaping decisions. The three had formed a unique family, one not bound by blood but by trust, respect, and shared experiences. As the years went by, Nayeli and Itzel took on more leadership within the ranch and within the community. They began teaching practical skills to villagers, especially young women, who were often at risk of being silenced or judged unfairly. They taught gardening, animal care, weaving, and basic household management, but also emphasized courage, fairness, and the importance of standing up against injustice. Mateo supported their efforts, never seeking recognition but content knowing that the women he had saved were empowering others to live free from fear. The bond between the three deepened over time, rooted in shared experience, trust, and love. They celebrated small successes together, a particularly strong harvest, a young villager mastering a new skill, or the first time one of the girls spoke out against an unfair tradition in her own family. These victories, though seemingly small, were profound, reflecting a shift in the culture around them. The ranch had become more than a home, it had become a beacon of hope and learning. The village's transformation became more evident with each passing year. Younger generations grew up seeing women treated with respect and encouraged to pursue their dreams. Elders gradually recognized the value of compassion and courage, slowly revising their thinking to include justice and mercy alongside tradition. The story of Nayeli, Itzel, and Mateo became a symbol, a lesson passed from one generation to the next, reminding everyone that even a single act of courage could spark change and inspire others to act with kindness and integrity. For Nayeli and Itzel, the ranch had become a place where dreams could flourish. They began planning for a future that was entirely their own, one filled with purpose, love, and the freedom to make choices. They discussed building small projects for the community, creating gardens and spaces for children to learn, and even organizing gatherings where people could discuss justice, fairness, and compassion. Their lives, once dictated by fear and oppression, were now a canvas on which they could paint their own destiny. Mateo, though proud of the women, remained humble. He never sought praise or recognition for his bravery, but he quietly observed the growth and resilience of Nayeli and Itzel. He knew that the true measure of success was not in the acts he had taken, but in the lives that had been changed, the courage that had been inspired, and the community that had begun to heal. Watching the women thrive, he felt a quiet contentment, knowing that the effort to act in the moment of injustice had created a lasting impact. As the sun set each evening over the rolling fields of the ranch, the three would sit together, reflecting on the journey they had traveled. They remembered the pain and fear of the past, but they also celebrated the courage, hope, and resilience that had carried them through. Nayeli and Itzel had transformed from victims into leaders, from frightened girls into women whose actions could influence and inspire others. Mateo had shown that even a solitary individual could act with courage and compassion, changing the course of lives and communities. Eventually, the story of the two women and the solitary rancher spread beyond the village. Travelers and neighboring communities shared the tale, speaking of bravery, survival, and moral courage. The legend, however, was not one of fear or cruelty, but of hope, justice, and the transformative power of empathy. People came to understand that standing up against injustice was not only possible but necessary, and that one act of courage could ripple across generations. Naeli and Itzel never forgot their roots or the hardships they endured, but they also understood that survival carried responsibility. They dedicated their lives to helping others, teaching young women to value themselves, and inspiring courage and fairness throughout their community. Mateo remained their steadfast ally, offering wisdom, guidance, and unwavering support. Together, the three of them had created a life that was meaningful, full of hope, and grounded in the principles of justice, compassion, and human dignity. In the end, the two women who were once condemned for being infertile had rewritten their own stories. They had survived cruelty, found strength in one another and in Mateo, and transformed fear into courage. The village, once rigid and unforgiving, began to embrace compassion and fairness. And the ranch, quiet and open, became a symbol of hope, a place where life, dignity, and courage were celebrated, where past horrors were replaced by growth, and where future generations could learn the true meaning of bravery and humanity. The legacy of that solitary rancher and the two brave women endured. The story of Naeli and Itzel and the man who saved them became a lesson for all who heard it. That one courageous act could save lives, that kindness could challenge cruelty, and that even the smallest gestures of empathy could change the hearts of a whole community. And so they lived on, not just as survivors, but as symbols of hope, courage, and the enduring power of compassion.